Hello everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host Tony, and today we're going to look at Command & Conquer, a real-time strategy title, developed and published by Westward Studios in 1995 for a variety of computer platforms including DOS, Windows, Mac OS, as well as several console-tweaked ports following in later years. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 102. I'm excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly gaming challenges, monthly gaming challenges, prizes, awards. It's all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout-out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. I'd also like to give a shout out to our newest honorary patron, Oliver Marshall. Oliver is one of our CGT Olympics silver medalists, and he also just recently took a trip to Greece, the true birthplace of the Olympics. Oliver, safe travels. I hope you enjoyed your trip, and thank you for listening to the show. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they are still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I cannot recommend these games to the broader gaming population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly, or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Command & Conquer. Command & Conquer is a real-time strategy title developed and published by Westwood Studios in 1995 for a bunch of different computer platforms, with console-tweaked ports following in later years. Before we can talk about Command & Conquer, we need to take a step back and talk about the formation of the company behind its creation, Westwood Studios. And to do that, we need to go back even further to discuss the two founding members of the company, Brett Sperry and Lewis Castle. Brett Sperry entered the video game industry in much the same way as many early video game developers. He simply started creating games in his spare time, having taught himself how to program simple software applications and eventually interactive experiences. Unlike many video game developers in the 80s, though, he didn't really have much of an interest in learning software development from an educational perspective, instead deciding to attend Arizona State University to major in psychology and architecture, which admittedly is a somewhat strange combination of scholarly pursuits. It didn't take long, though, before Sperry decided that formal education just wasn't for him. So he left the university after attending for a year and decided from that point on that he was going to become a video game developer. He taught himself how to program, and with his skill set beginning to develop even further, sought out employment in Las Vegas, Nevada, eventually performing contractor work for iMagic, which was famous itself for becoming the second third-party publishing company ever formed after Activision and their break from Atari's corporate structure. Sperry worked on several games for iMagic, but nothing that would be considered a breakout hit. And as the North American video game market crash of 1983 sent the majority of gaming companies into a tailspin, Sperry was left in a situation where contract work was quickly drying up. He still wanted to create games, but the market conditions of the time meant that meaningful work was hard to come by. At the same time as the video game industry was experiencing a significant dip in sales, other areas of the burgeoning computer market were continuing to see upward growth, driven primarily by the broader adoption of computers as not just office productivity machines, but also devices that could potentially serve a purpose in the home. This rise of the personal computer market drove talented software developers to seek out work with a number of computer software companies, oftentimes with similar contract-based work as what was traditionally leveraged in the video game industry. Interestingly, despite the fact that there are some fairly significant differences between developing a video game and developing a piece of productivity software, oftentimes software developers from across the entire computer industry would meet to exchange notes, talk about their latest work, and otherwise just hang out with like-minded people. It was during one of those moments of downtime in 1983 that Brett Sperry met another software developer working as a contractor in the computer software space, a man by the name of Lewis Castle. It didn't take long before Sperry and Castle became friends, and in the process, they began sharing some ideas about how they could potentially work together in the future. And here, discussions quickly shifted to the recently crashed video and computer game industry. Sure, work with established companies around this time was not widely available, but Sperry and Castle considered that perhaps they could form their own independent software company, effectively hiring themselves to work on the future of interactive entertainment. The duo brainstormed ideas for around a year and a half, until finally, in 1985, they decided to make their plans official. From the cozy confines of a garage in sunny Las Vegas, Brellis Software was born. Only the name Brellis Software doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, especially for a company that was intended to hopefully create entertaining, interactive games for players around the world to enjoy. In an effort to make their company sound a bit more exciting, 2 months after Brellis Software was born, it would be rechristened as Westwood Associates, a reference to the up-and-coming Westwood area of Los Angeles, California. This new name, while a bit more exciting than Brellis Software, was intentionally chosen to not be a 100% gaming-centric kind of moniker, the reason being that both Sperry and Castle were unsure if their video game development careers would actually take off. Choosing a name like Westwood Associates would give the pair the ability to pivot as the need arises. It sounded good enough to be the name of a game development studio, but also serious enough to create business software if their game development dreams went up in smoke. From their perspective, it was the perfect compromise, and as Westwood Associates, the two would begin seeking out opportunities to make a name for themselves in the video and computer game industry. The duo's earliest efforts centered primarily on contract work in support of other companies, like Epix and Strategy Simulations Incorporated, or SSI, and mainly focused on creating ports of popular 8-bit titles to the newer 16-bit architectures powering modern computers of the time, like the Commodore Amiga and Atari ST computer platforms. These early efforts garnered the company some early praise and some profits, which Sperry and Castle used to begin developing their own concepts into standalone games in-house, seeking out publishing deals to bring these homegrown titles to the market. Looking back at the early years of Westward Associates, it's incredibly interesting to see that the team worked on a huge variety of game types and genres, from educational titles like Donald's Alphabet Chase, to card games like Blackjack Academy, to licensed action titles like A Nightmare on Elm Street, to graphical interactive fiction like Circuit's Edge. The number of titles Westward Associates worked on and released was pretty extensive, and from 1988 to 1993, the company would release almost 20 distinct titles, many of which encompassed different genres and playstyles. One type of game, though, seemed to dominate Westward's early work, and that is the venerable role-playing game. As part of Westward's original partnership with SSI, they were granted the opportunity to work on some of that company's RPG titles, which would end up demonstrating just how talented the Westward team had become in the years after it was founded. SSI itself was founded in 1979, and from its earliest days was focused on creating games that attempted to bring the tabletop strategy wargaming experience to home computers. From its founding through the mid-80s, SSI rapidly established itself as the expert at delivering well-crafted strategic titles to wargamers around the world, with numerous publications declaring SSI to be far more talented than its nearest competition, oftentimes referring to the company as being in a class of its own when it came to strategic wargaming on personal computers. SSI would eventually branch out to other tangential, albeit less war-centric genres, and in 1984, would dive into the computer role-playing space with the release of Questron, the company's very first RPG. As with any new endeavor, expectations around the new game were tempered by realism. SSI was releasing a title in a genre they were unfamiliar with, and while they had high hopes for success, they also knew that breaking into a new gaming genre was not without risk. After Questron was released, though, any concerns around the viability of SSI's RPG pursuits quickly evaporated, as that title would sell almost 35,000 copies, becoming the fastest-selling game in the company's history up to that point, as well as outselling nearly any other title they had created by a factor of 3 to 1. SSI's first RPG was an unmitigated success. And with that success, SSI continued to expand its focus on the RPG genre, with many of their efforts being contracted out to other companies to develop, while SSI would end up publishing those titles. Such was the case with Questron 2, the follow-up to SSI's most popular title up to that point, which Westward Associates ended up co-developing with Quest Software in 1988. Questron 2 would end up selling even more copies than its predecessor, and as a result of that success, SSI began looking at Westward Associates as an up-and-coming company that could be relied upon to develop meaningful and engaging RPG experiences. This early success is what led to Westward being asked to develop several RPGs utilizing the Dungeons & Dragons license, an incredibly popular tabletop RPG property that SSI had acquired the rights to in 1987. Using the D&D license, Westwood would go on to develop console-exclusive titles like Warriors of the Eternal Sun for the Sega Genesis and Order of the Griffin for the TurboGrafx-16. But by far, the most popular and successful D&D RPG that Westwood would end up being responsible for was the Eye of the Beholder computer role-playing game series. Eye of the Beholder, unlike Westwood's other efforts up to that point, would be an unmitigated success, with several 100,000 copies of Eye of the Beholder 1 and 2 sold following their respective releases. And beyond commercial performance, both titles would be praised by gamers and critics alike, many of whom would declare the games in the Eye of the Beholder series to be some of the best CRPGs created for the time, and potentially a predictor of future successes for Westward Associates. Westwood's success with the Eye of the Beholder series was a strong indication that the company itself was evolving, and as Westwood's staff grew to encompass more than 50 talented individuals across a wide range of disciplines, they were quickly proving themselves to be a dependable video game development studio. I didn't mention it earlier, but Westwood's early efforts, while moderately successful, weren't without some issues. In particular, Westwood had developed a somewhat negative reputation for missing milestone delivery dates, often shipping products well beyond their expected release windows. This, it turns out, was simply the company experiencing growing pains, and by the time Eye of the Beholder 2 released on the market in 1991, Westwood Associates was beginning to make a name for themselves as being one of the more dependable game development studios in the industry. They had effectively made a 180-degree turn from just 4 years prior, and were now one of the few companies that could be counted on to deliver a game on time, on budget, and without significant bugs or issues that needed to be addressed. Oh, and the games themselves? Those were pretty darn fun too. With that maturation came newfound success, and different companies began looking at Westwood Associates as a group to watch, with several major studios like Sierra Online and Virgin Games bringing forward proposals to purchase the company in an effort to bolster their own stables of talented game development studios. Sperry and Castle considered all of the offers that were on the table, and eventually in 1992 decided to allow Westwood Associates to be acquired by Virgin Games, despite the fact that Sierra Online had come forward with a higher offer. Sperry and Castle, however, weren't interested in just making money. They wanted autonomy to create the games they wanted to make, and they felt that under Virgin Games they'd have more of an opportunity to do just that, while Sierra's deal, despite being more lucrative, wouldn't have provided the team with as much creative freedom. So, from that point on, Westwood Associates would become part of Virgin Games, and as part of that transition, the company itself would undergo a name change. With Sperry and Castle no longer fearing for the future of their game development dreams, they decided to rename Westwood Associates to something that better fit their game-centric focus. Westwood Associates would now be known as Westwood Studios. As Westwood Studios, the team didn't take long to continue delivering quality games to the masses, with their first title, the point-and-click adventure The Legend of Corandia, being a big seller for the company, a success that proved to Virgin Games that their decision to acquire Westwood was a good one. It would be Westwood Studios' next game, however, that would change the trajectory of the company forever. Recall our discussion from several minutes ago about the various RPG titles that Westwood had worked on previously, most notably in support of their partnership with SSI. Well, even though those titles were most definitely RPG experiences, Westwood always had an interest in adding more tactical and strategic gameplay to their titles. In the context of the RPGs they had worked on, this meant that combat encounters were often a bit more in-depth and complex than many other RPGs released around the same time, something that Westwood believed distinguished their games as more strategic than their peers. And given their association with SSI, the leading strategic wargame studio in the industry, it's not hard to see how that pedigree could shape, at least in part, the mechanics that Westwood would seek to imbue their games with. Following the release of The Legend of Corandia in 1992, Westwood would have the opportunity to take all of the strategic and tactical know-how they had developed while working with SSI and use that experience to create a standalone real-time strategy title the likes of which the world had never seen. That title was none other than Dune 2. Now, the curious amongst you might be wondering, okay, Dune 2, what the heck happened to Dune 1? Well, that's actually an interesting story, and to better understand what was going on with that title, we have to dive a bit further back into history. Back in the 1950s, following the conclusion of World War II, science fiction became one of the most popular genres in film and literature. Spurred on by advances in computer technology, the prospect of space exploration, and the advent of nuclear energy, coupled with the relief that came with knowing one of the biggest conflicts the world had ever seen was now concluded, people from across the globe began turning their attention to more imaginative pursuits, and a number of creative individuals began to write stories that would eventually propel science fiction into the future. One of those creative individuals who had always been fond of science fiction was a young author by the name of Frank Herbert. From a very early age, Herbert enjoyed reading all sorts of things, whether that was the latest fiction novel or simply the daily newspaper, and he impressed his parents with his aptitude and veracity for reading. One genre, however, dominated Herbert's imagination, and that was science fiction. Herbert devoured science fiction novels by such popular authors as H.G. Wells and Robert Heinlein, and this interest in the genre would eventually inspire Herbert to begin writing his own science fiction stories in 1952, with the release of the story Looking for Something, which would be published in the sci-fi magazine Startling Stories. From that humble beginning, Herbert would begin writing other science fiction stories, submitting those concepts to magazines and oftentimes getting published in their monthly releases, while also taking assignments from other magazines, acting as a freelance journalist throughout the 1950s. One day, as part of that freelance work, Herbert would be assigned to write an article about sand dunes in Oregon, which from my perspective is a pretty dry topic. Sorry. But apparently, Herbert really devoted himself to the task at hand, taking a copious amount of notes as he researched extensively the Oregon Dunes National Recreation Center, eventually capturing far more content than he'd ever need for a magazine article on sand dunes. While that article would never be published, it did serve as the spark that would lead Frank Herbert to come up with an idea for a brand new science fiction universe, the incredibly influential, epic sci-fi novel, Dune. Dune would be published in 1965 and would over time spawn an entire media franchise that persists to today, becoming the greatest selling science fiction novel series of all time, spurring Hollywood to release several big-budget films, most notably the modern Dune series under Denis Villeneuve, and, most pertinent to our discussion, driving intrepid game development studios to attempt to translate the world of Dune into an interactive experience. The first attempt to bring Dune into the digital domain fell to a group of Frank Herbert fans working as part of the newly created development studio Cryo Interactive in 1990. This small team of dedicated developers and designers worked for 6 months, planning out a detailed game design that included a mix of point-and-click adventure gameplay mixed with strategy game mechanics, a combination that not everyone at the game's publisher, Virgin Games, was convinced would work. The issue was, there was a bit of a cultural divide between Cryo and Virgin, or at least the group at Virgin that held the rights to the Dune license. Cryo Interactive was a French-based development studio with their own design principles and aesthetics, and the group at Virgin that Cryo was working most closely with, Virgin Games USA, was an American company who believed that the French style of video games, complete with a more painterly art style and prominent user interface, just wouldn't appeal to a broader international market. Interestingly, while Virgin Games USA held the rights to the Dune license and therefore had authority over that property, the company itself was a subsidiary of the much bigger conglomerate Virgin Games, a British video game development studio that acted as a mega corporation with a number of geographically dispersed video game studios around the world. When discussions between Cryo and Virgin USA continued to deteriorate, parent organization Virgin Games became involved, acting as a go-between for the two companies until eventually the divide became too great, and Virgin USA pulled out of the deal, taking the Dune license with them and leaving Cryo with a massive design document, but nothing to ultimately use that design on. At this point, it seemed like Cryo's Dune project would be scrapped, though in fact, that is not what ended up happening. At this point in our story, things get a little confusing. Virgin USA, having pulled the Dune license away from Cryo, decided to award another company, Westwood Studios, with the Dune license, and it's not too hard to see why they would do that. Westwood, like we've talked about, had developed into a highly dependable and talented game development studio, and Virgin USA believed they could do the Dune license justice. They also liked the fact that Westwood was an American company, and therefore would likely design their game using a more American aesthetic, which Virgin USA believed would sell better than Cryo's French design ideas. So Westwood set off to begin creating their version of Dune, which would be designed as a fast-paced real-time strategy game, while Cryo would also keep developing their version of Dune? Yes, you heard that right. Despite the fact that Cryo no longer had the license to Dune, their development team was still working on that game, completely in secret, while receiving funding from the British arm of Virgin Games, also entirely in secret. This was kinda crazy to me, as I legitimately don't see how anyone working on the game could have assumed this was going to end well. But regardless, the team at Cryo was working in secret on their totally unofficial Dune game, while Westwood Studios was working on their totally official Dune game, having been told that the Cryo Dune game had already been cancelled. Regardless, Cryo's Dune title would continue evolving as an adventure strategy hybrid, which was a fairly unique combination to use for the creation of a game. Westwood Studios' Dune title, however, would be even more innovative. Recall that Westwood Studios had previously worked with SSI, the company responsible for countless computerized wargaming strategy titles released throughout the 80s and early 90s. SSI had seen some success with their wargaming titles, but ultimately, those games serviced a very niche market, and innovation in the genre had been stale for some time. Brett Sperry, one of Westwood's co-founders, believed that the reason wargames were losing market share was because, in his words, they sucked, having a complete lack of innovation and poor designs overall, a combination that would make it very difficult to appeal to any consumers other than the most hardcore wargame strategy gamers, which was a fairly limited audience. Sperry believed that if you took the core strategic elements of such a game, sped up the action, and improved the interface and controls to be primarily mouse-driven as opposed to keyboard hotkey-centric, there would be a much bigger potential audience for the game, and by extension, you'd have a much better game overall. These design principles focused on strategic, fast-paced gameplay coupled with real-time resource management, map navigation, and intuitive controls are what would form the foundation for Westwood Studios' version of Dune, which was coming along nicely until late 1991, when it was finally discovered that there was another Dune game already in development, that being Cryo Interactive's unofficial, secretive Dune project. Tensions reached a boiling point as Virgin Games attempted to figure out how to resolve the situation without any sort of negative impact to any party, though the easiest and most likely answer was to simply cancel Cryo Interactive's Dune game, for real this time, and let Westwood continue developing their title. Cryo, to their credit, had made a ton of progress on their secretive Dune game in the year or so following their shift to developing the game in secret, so they decided to show Virgin USA the current version of their title, hoping that they'd be able to stave off cancellation and not have wasted over a year's worth of work on something that would never come to be. Luckily for Cryo, their Dune game was pretty darn good, and even Virgin USA had to concede that Cryo had a hit on their hands. So they did something almost unthinkable. They uncanceled the game, officially, and gave Cryo additional funding to bring the game to the finish line. This would eventually result in Dune by Cryo Interactive releasing to stores everywhere in early 1992. Only, there was still Westwood's game to think about, which from their perspective was the only official Dune game in development. Westwood's Dune wasn't quite ready to launch just yet. So when Cryo completed development on their title, Virgin Games told them to release the game as Dune, and Westwood Studios was instructed to rename their title Dune 2. Sperry and the rest of Westwood's leadership team protested this change, claiming that a title that was worked on unofficially for the last year shouldn't leapfrog their official game. But unfortunately for them, the decision was already made. Westwood Studios would end up releasing Dune 2 in December of 1992, and in the process created confusion for gamers everywhere, as they tried to figure out how this title was a sequel to Cryo's Dune that had released earlier in the year. In reality, it wasn't a sequel of any kind, but was instead the result of a series of increasingly bizarre events that amusingly sounded like it'd be tailor-made for a Hollywood movie as opposed to a bunch of meetings between game developers and publishing companies. Regardless, this confusion didn't in any way diminish Westwood's Dune 2, which was released to rave reviews and introduced most gamers for the first time to the concept of a fast-paced real-time strategy game. That's not to say that there weren't real-time strategy games before Dune 2, it's just that in comparison to those older titles, Dune 2 was a breath of fresh air, a new take on the RTS formula that would become so influential that it effectively set the standard for what future real-time strategy games would have to adhere to. This new standard, which included resource gathering and unit management, base building using gathered resources, fast-paced gameplay, a mouse-driven interface, and the inclusion of a gameplay mechanic known as the Fog of War, where certain sections of the map were only revealed after being discovered by a player, proved to be an addicting combination, eventually resulting in over 250,000 copies sold in the years following its release, and proving Westwood Studios, once again, was a highly talented game development studio with a bright future ahead of them. And interestingly, that future began while Dune 2 was still being developed. As Dune 2 neared its release, the team at Westwood began discussing how they could potentially take their new RTS framework and apply it to a future title. While Dune 2 had not been released yet, and it was therefore uncertain whether the game-playing public would enjoy the game, the internal team felt very strongly about the quality of the title, and as a result, they began laying out the framework for their next strategy game. While the team was grateful to have been working on a game with a popular license, they believed they could do even more if they had the opportunity to work on a completely original title, created using their own brand new intellectual property and ideas. At the same time, the team had collected a number of features that they wanted to implement with Dune 2, but ultimately didn't have an opportunity to integrate with the game. The thought across the team was, if they could come up with an original idea for a new game, married with the RTS framework they created for Dune 2, and enhanced with their wish list of mechanics and features that they didn't have time to add to Dune, then they'd have, in their words, the ultimate RTS. This decision to make the ultimate be-all, end-all real-time strategy game is what formed the foundation for the creation of Command & Conquer. As the team sat down to begin making Command & Conquer, initial efforts were focused on what kind of setting to include with the game, with early ideas centering on a concept for a high fantasy-styled world, complete with different races, classes, and magic. And if we take a look at Westwood's history, it's not too surprising that such an idea would be proposed for their new game. Westwood had worked on a ton of RPGs in its earlier years, and they were well-versed with fantasy settings for video and computer games. Here, though, real-world events would eventually dictate a change in direction, as the mid-90s political climate, coupled with the aftermath of the Gulf War and the frequent news reports on armed conflicts around the world, would lead Brett Sperry, Lewis Castle, and the rest of the Command & Conquer team to pivot to a more realistic depiction of modern, if not slightly futuristic, warfare, where a collection of allied nations would be in constant conflict with a multinational terrorist organization that threatened the safety of the entire world. This conflict would be played out over a series of different battlefields across a wide variety of geographic areas, with Westwood using digitized images of real-world locations and terrains as the inspiration for the various locations in the game, lending an air of realism to the experience and making the stakes for failure feel that much higher. Creating the two warring sides of the conflict, the Global Defense Initiative, or GDI, and the Brotherhood of Nod, would require the collective talents of everyone across the development team, as both sides needed to be balanced, but still distinct, both in terms of their look, feel, and overall combat mechanics. In some instances, that meant that certain combat units on each side would effectively be copies of each other, like infantry, while others would be balanced such that specific units on one side would act as direct counters to units on the other side. The balance at play here extended not just to the mechanics associated with the units themselves, but also to the cost for each unit, which required a scarce resource, Tiberium, to be harvested prior to purchasing combat units or various base structures. Tiberium was used as the basis of the game's constrained resource economy, and the game's designers structured each map to give either the GDI or the Brotherhood of Nod an advantage when it came to the ability to harvest Tiberium, which helped to drive the overall challenge associated with each discrete mission. And speaking of those missions, both the GDI and Brotherhood of Nod would have a ton of missions created for each side, connected together via an overarching campaign for each side with a defined, cohesive story told with cutscenes prior to each mission. And those cutscenes, much to my delight, all included glorious live-action full-motion video scenes. Longtime listeners of the podcast know that I absolutely love FMV in gaming, and the fact that Command & Conquer would include FMV in its cutscenes is something I'll definitely talk about when we get to our Suitor review of the game. From the perspective of the game's designers, though, using FMV was a conscious decision as a means to make the game feel even more real, and the team at Westwood had high hopes that the included cutscenes would make the game feel even more impactful to potential players. There was just one issue. Westwood didn't have the ability to hire a bunch of Hollywood actors, and they didn't even have the budget to bring in B-list celebrities. Instead, the majority of the F&B cutscenes were filmed using various staff from across the Westwood team in starring roles, in much the same way that many video game development studios utilize developers, artists, and other staff to make up the casts for their games. For Command & Conquer, only one person, Joseph Kukan, who ended up playing the main antagonist Kane, had any degree of formal actor training, so it would fall to him to teach the rest of the staff how to act on film, a task that he enjoyed performing, even if it was a bit difficult to work with a group of individuals who wouldn't even rank as amateur actors. The team realized that they didn't have trained actors on staff, so they never expected to film cutscenes that felt quote-unquote professional. But both Lewis Castle and Brett Sperry agreed that despite their limited experience, the team of pseudo-actors used in the game did an outstanding job of creating something that was, and I quote, reasonably good. Over a period of over 2 years, Westwood would work on bringing Command & Conquer to life, and everyone who worked on the game was so excited about its potential that numerous staff from around that time have said in interviews that it didn't even feel like they were working because they were having so much fun. There was certainly tension, and there were high expectations to deliver a quality product. But because everyone was on the same page and focused on delivering a revolutionary new gaming experience, there was never any true contention throughout the entirety of the development period for the game. And then, finally, after 2 years of intense but fun development, Command & Conquer would be ready for release. In late 1995, the game would launch for the MS-DOS computer platform and would immediately garner significant critical and player praise, with numerous publications naming Command & Conquer as the best strategy game of the year, with some even going so far as to naming it the best game of the year overall. Many publications praised the game's graphics, gameplay, and multiplayer, which was a key feature the team originally wanted to implement for Dune 2, but would instead include in Command & Conquer. The quality of the game and overall design would propel Command & Conquer to the top of numerous sales charts, and in just a little over a year following its release, it would sell nearly 2 million copies, with more than 1 million more copies sold in the years that followed. And that's not even including the numerous ports of the title, both to other computer platforms as well as home consoles, each of which were critically and commercially successful, and would pave the way for Command & Conquer to become not just one of the most influential real-time strategy games of all time, but also cemented Westwood Studios as one of the top game development studios in the world. Command & Conquer would go on to spawn a huge franchise of sequels, spin-offs, and expansion packs, with the first 2 games in the series just recently receiving remasters back in 2020, a release that would serve to both reignite the fervent Command & Conquer fanbase that had enjoyed the games previously, while also introducing the series to a whole new generation of real-time strategy gamers for them to appreciate. Across the entire series, Command & Conquer would sell over 30 million copies and is undeniably one of the most well-known and profitable game series of all time. Westwood Studios would continue to make well-respected games over the course of its lifetime, including new entries in the Command & Conquer series, as well as the beloved point-and-click adventure title Blade Runner. Unfortunately, after being acquired by Electronic Arts in 1998, Westwood would experience a string of releases that did not meet the demands of EA corporate leadership, meaning they didn't sell millions of copies every single time they were released, and this lack of sales is what would drive the company to be closed in early 2003. While a number of individuals previously involved with Westwood Studios would go off to join other game studios, the collection of talent that Westwood was able to acquire over the years would ultimately scatter to the wind. An unfortunate end to a company that was, at one point in time, considered one of the best in the industry. The importance of Westwood Studios in video and computer game history and its most well-known game series, Command & Conquer, cannot be overstated. The team at Westwood Studios succeeded in delivering an experience that would, for all intents and purposes, popularize real-time strategy games across the world, a genre that had never reached significant sales or market penetration before Command & Conquer released, but after, would find a permanent foothold in the industry that persists even to this day. While Westwood Studios may no longer exist today, its work and influence live on, and a large part of that is due to their efforts in creating Command & Conquer. Whether you consider yourself a strategic mastermind or you can't even spell GDI, the fact is that Command & Conquer is an experience that countless gamers hold as a high watermark in the RTS space, and as such, is undeniably a title that will be remembered fondly forever. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Command & Conquer today versus when it was released almost 30 years ago. At its core, Command & Conquer is pretty much a prototypical real-time strategy game, meaning that it is one of the earliest RTSs that made the genre what it is today, but doesn't have many of the bells, whistles, or creature comforts that modern real-time strategy gamers enjoy. Like pretty much every RTS, your goal is to defeat your opponent, which oftentimes involves building up resources, constructing buildings and combat units, engaging in warfare, and capturing or destroying enemy assets, with these foundational features making up the core framework of the real-time strategy genre. So you might think there isn't much to talk about here, simply label Command & Conquer an RTS and go on about your day. But here, you'd be wrong, as even though Command & Conquer isn't particularly unique in the RTS space, there are still a number of design decisions we absolutely need to talk about, both to understand how it feels to play an old-school real-time strategy game, as well as to understand how those feelings translate into what is decidedly an old-school experience, complete with feelings of accomplishment after surpassing a challenging scenario, only to be counterbalanced by feelings of frustration when you encounter a situation where the artificial intelligence in the game effectively turns on a cheat mode to literally run down all of your forces. We'll talk about all that stuff in just a couple minutes, but first, I need to level set everyone with my own prior experience with the RTS genre. In short, I don't have a ton of experience here. I mean, sure, I've played real-time strategy games before, like several games in the Age of Empires series, as well as Command & Conquer itself on the Sega Saturn, which I recall enjoying immensely, though thinking about playing an RTS using a controller makes my head hurt in retrospect, not to mention other brief forays into the genre. That said, I would never consider myself a real-time strategy gamer. As you all know, I'll play and likely enjoy pretty much any kind of game ever made. I'm not the kind of person that says no to any particular genre in gaming. But the simple fact is that I do not frequently play real-time strategy games, so my perspective here is coming from someone who probably last earnestly played an RTS over 20 years ago. If you are a regular RTS gamer, it's entirely possible some of my observations here will have the sound of a noob learning to play a hardcore real-time strategy game, and in some ways, it's probably accurate. For everyone else though, the people who maybe play an RTS once in a blue moon or dabble in the genre, I think most of my comments will likely resonate a little bit more. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's talk about Command & Conquer. And to be clear, I am talking about the DOS original title, not any of the re-releases or remasters that have come out, which undoubtedly smooth out some aspects of the experience a little bit. Assuming you're playing the DOS version too, the first thing you'll notice is that when you begin a new game, you're given an option of a campaign on which to play, either the Global Defense Initiative or GDI, which are the proverbial good guys in the game, or the Brotherhood of Nod, led by the charismatic cult-like leader Kane, who are undeniably the bad guys here. Depending on which campaign you select, you'll experience a fairly significant difference in gameplay styles, though the core mechanics of gameplay, like the need to harvest materials to construct buildings and units, really don't differ between the two factions. Each side does have their own specific buildings and combat units, which I thought was a nice touch, while other more common items are shared between the GDI and Brotherhood, as you'd likely expect. The act of playing each campaign provides a bit of a different feel, depending on which side you choose, and for reference, I did play and complete both single-player campaigns. Though here, again, I should offer a bit of personal perspective. When I play a game, I usually play as the good guy, whether that's in games that offer some form of player choice or alignment system, or in games that offer alternate factions to explore, in which case I usually play the good guy campaign first before going back to play the bad guy campaign. And for Command & Conquer, that is exactly what I did, playing the GDI campaign before touching the Brotherhood of Nod storyline. And the individual campaign and missions within each campaign can be fairly lengthy, so simply completing a single campaign can take well over 10 hours. I mention all of this to say that, from my perspective, the GDI campaign was dramatically more difficult and lengthy than the Brotherhood of Nod campaign, but I can't tell if that's because the campaign is in fact easier, or if I just finally learned how to play the game effectively and was able to apply those learnings to my Brotherhood playthrough. I'm thinking it's probably the latter, but regardless, we'll talk more about my thoughts on the game's difficulty in a little bit. Anyway, regardless of which campaign you choose, the game is structured in much the same way, with a series of missions that you need to complete in order to progress through your chosen campaign and eventually beat the game. For the GDI, there are 15 different missions, though apparently one can be skipped if you do the appropriate action in a prior mission, while in the Nod campaign there are 13 different missions. So fairly similar between the two sides. As you play through each campaign, you'll notice that many of the missions provide several choices for how to make progress, with some missions allowing you to choose one of 3 different paths forward. Interestingly, these different paths are all very rarely similar to each other, and most often your choice can lead to incredibly different missions, despite all of them being labeled as, say, your 8th mission. These divergent paths through the game add a ton of replayability, as well as some sweaty palms, because you never know if you're going to choose a scenario that is easier, a nicely balanced challenge, or one that will haunt your dreams and make you curse your decision. And actually, this is probably as good a time as any to talk about the game's difficulty, which does vary pretty widely from short and sweet, easy kinds of missions in the early game to incredibly frustrating, almost unfair scenarios later in the game. Here again, I need to mention that I personally experienced more frustration during the GDI campaign, and by the time I reached the Nod campaign, I found the experience much more enjoyable to play without wanting to break my keyboard in half. I'm sure some of this was a result of my own abilities increasing, but in other instances, I truly do believe that the GDI campaign was designed less expertly than its Nod counterpart. To really understand why that is, we need to take a look at the ways each side differs, so that we can dive into what makes each side unique and, ultimately, a force to be reckoned with on the battlefield. Let's start by talking about the GDI, who, given they represent an actual funded organization, oftentimes have the best, most defensive equipment on the market. They utilize a variety of heavy machinery like tanks, armored personnel carriers, gunboats, and helicopters to conquer their foes, though the majority of their weaponry is a bit weaker offensively. The GDI feels like playing a defensive tank in an RPG. They're a bit slower, they take less damage than other classes, and are a bit more methodical, but can still pack a punch when they need to, at least in punctuated bursts. The Brotherhood of Nod uses much more powerful offensive weaponry, and most of their vehicles, like stealth and flame tanks, recon bikes, and buggies, are designed with maneuverability and offensive capability in mind, which makes controlling Nod resources feel much brisker paced than their GDI counterparts. That being said, Nod resources, especially the vehicles focused on maneuverability and speed, are usually pretty fragile defensively, and a couple of grenade or tank blasts are usually good enough to put you down for the count. By contrast, most GDI vehicles can take a beating without breaking a sweat. It's an interesting balance, and the two sides definitely play differently as a result. Between the two, I think I prefer the Nod style of offensive gameplay more than the GDI's defensive capabilities, but both certainly have their pros and cons. Regardless of which side you choose though, you'll be faced with one undeniable fact. The computer is undoubtedly better than you at managing their resources, their combat units, and navigation around each mission's map. And honestly, It's not even close, at least for a casual RTS player like I am. To better describe why that is, let's look at a few different scenarios that played out during my recent battles, which in retrospect I can laugh at, but in the moment mostly made me utter strings of profanities that likely should never be repeated. We'll start with the individual capabilities of the on-foot combat units in the game, which for the GDI consists of minigunners, grenadiers, bazooka operators, and engineers. As you might expect, minigunners are the traditional infantry kind of unit, while grenadiers have outstandingly powerful attacks with their grenades, if you're close enough to hit the enemy you're trying to blow up, while bazooka operators give a bit more range than grenadiers, and are incredibly useful for long-range attacks against armored units. The Nod shares many of the same resources as the GDI, with minigunners, bazooka operators, and engineers common between the two. The Brotherhood of Nod, however, receives a flamethrower unit instead of the GDI's Grenadier, who you might have guessed uses a flamethrower to attempt to make s'mores out of anyone who attempts to get in their way. When I was playing the GDI campaign, I naturally gravitated towards using grenades as my primary on-foot unit type, because the damage, at least when hits landed, was great, and I felt like I could bunch up a bunch of grenadiers and have them all focus fire on a single target to make short work of almost anything I was fighting. There was the risk of some friendly fire splash damage, but I felt like the potential offensive capabilities of the unit were worth the risk. So, playing the game, I'd noticed that my grenade users often needed multiple hits to take out an enemy, which I figured, fine, there's some sort of mathematical calculation going on to make it so that the game can't be trivialized with explosive firepower. No problem. But then, I ran into my first computer-controlled flamethrower enemy, and let me tell you, that is an experience I will never forget. Before I realized that bunching up a ton of soldiers is probably not a good idea, that's exactly the way I had been playing the game. I'd build a bunch of grenade lobbers, select them all, and tell them all to attack a single target, or a series of incoming targets. Well, like I mentioned a moment ago, when you as a player throw those grenades, they don't always cause mass destruction, and many enemies require multiple hits, or one random direct hit to be defeated. I was standing on the battlefield, tossing grenades left and right, when over the horizon rose a strange-looking figure with a gas tank on his back and a flamethrower in his hands. He started a methodical walk towards me, kind of like Michael Myers stalking his latest victim, but I thought, no big deal. I've got the distance, and I've got the high ground. I'll pepper this fool with grenades, and he won't even touch me. Only those grenades never did stop him, and he proceeded to calmly approach my platoon, aim his flamethrower in our direction, and flambe us all to death, literally with one pull of the trigger. My jaw literally dropped as I saw around 7 of my finest soldiers burnt to a crisp, and I'm fairly certain I let out an audible WTF as soon as it happened. That situation by itself, I can wrap my head around, and that moment actually helped me improve my strategies in the future, so in retrospect, I appreciated the teaching moment. But at that point, I also vowed that when I played the Nod campaign, I would make certain to have some fun with that flamethrower, especially when combating those hapless GDI grenadiers that I personally found out were super inaccurate. Fast forward around 15 hours, and I finally have my chance to try out that flamethrower. I see a single grenade GDI soldier on the battlefield, and I think to myself in my best Arnold Schwarzenegger impersonation, haha, looks like he needs a warm-up. And yes, I do occasionally think to myself in one-liners. Anyway, I started walking to this helpless grenadier, ready to unleash my fiery fury upon him, and right as I was about to pull the trigger, he caught a glimpse of me and tossed a single grenade in my direction. Poor fool, I thought to myself as I remembered how many grenades it took me to defeat one of the Nod soldiers during my GDI campaign. I assumed I was perfectly safe. Only to discover that the computer-controlled grenadier must have been packing some serious heat, because not only did that single grenade make my full-health flamethrower unit literally explode into bits and pieces, but the blast damage, coupled with my flamethrower tank exploding, also killed my 2 companions situated a bit behind me. 1 grenade, 1 throw. That was a decidedly different experience than what I had seen. It was at this point that I realized the artificial intelligence in Command & Conquer cheats, or at a minimum, is tuned to be better than you, the player, and then I started to notice how other aspects of the game demonstrated this fact over and over again and again. Take, for example, the fact that the computer has the omnipresent ability to control every single unit under its command flawlessly and independently, and compare that to the player's ability to manage resources that might be spread across a map, without any ability to pause the action at any point to get a grasp on the situation. In the original Command & Conquer, there was no zoomed-out map or ability to really survey the battlefield, and as a result, your view into each game was fairly limited. Now, in all fairness, there are a ton of keyboard commands at your disposal to make controlling and viewing multiple units in different areas of the map feasible, like the ability to assign different units to a team, and the ability to focus the camera on that team regardless of where on the map you might currently be. But even with that, controlling individual units with the same aptitude as the computer is something that you'll likely never be able to do unless you practice and play the game for hours upon hours. You will get better over time, and by the end of my playthrough, I had gotten fairly adept at micromanaging my teams and units. But I still didn't do this nearly as well as the computer. Nothing illustrates this fact quite as well as when you find yourself facing an enemy-heavy vehicle like a tank, which has the ability to run over you in addition to simply firing munition at you. As you might expect, getting run over is an instant death experience, and can quickly decimate a group of bunched up soldiers, which is another reason why you should not simply group soldiers up in the hopes of overpowering an enemy. Well, as a player, trying to avoid getting run over by a tank is pretty darn tricky, especially when trying to control multiple units at the same time. The artificial intelligence will make a perfect beeline for your position, and while you can supposedly scatter your troops by pressing the X key on your keyboard, this very rarely ended up stopping the AI's rampage. If the AI wanted to run you over, it was going to do so, period. Contrast this with you trying to run over an AI-controlled opponent, who somehow gains the ability to juke and jive around your tank's treads like Lamar Jackson going for a touchdown, all the while peppering you with firepower and causing your unit's hit points to dwindle. I kept thinking to myself, am I doing something wrong? Before coming to the conclusion that, no, it's not me, the AI is just a filthy cheater. There are other instances that also demonstrate this fact, like how Tiberium, the resource you harvest in order to build units and buildings, is utilized. As a player, your store of Tiberium is dictated entirely by your ability to harvest the semi-rare material and optimize your spend, and I can guarantee that there will be various times throughout your playthrough where you're running so low on Tiberium that you simply need to wait for your harvester to return before you can take any pertinent action. This never seems to be a problem for the AI though, as it appears as though they have a nearly unlimited supply of the stuff, and while you can see the AI harvesting Tiberium and think, oh cool, they're playing by the same rules I am, the fact is, they are not. I've read that you can, in certain instances, bankrupt the computer by cutting off their supply lines, but this either requires too much time, or must be utilizing some tactic I'm missing, because even when capturing the AI's refinery, destroying their harvesters, and claiming their Tiberium silos for my own, they always had resources available to repair damaged buildings and rebuild destroyed structures, sometimes right next to my actively fighting platoon, which, let me tell you, is a big kick in the groin when that happens, especially if it's something like the ultra-powerful Nod Obelisk of Light, which literally shoots a freaking laser beam at you, one hit killing any on-foot unit and severely damaging any vehicles it targets. By the way, I totally used that Obelisk of Light during my Nod campaign, and it is kinda legitimately awesome. Anyway, I'll go over my strategies for combating this AI ridiculousness in just a little bit, but suffice it to say, there are some definite disparities between the AI's power and your own. That's not even to mention the scenarios that are designed to be unfair right from the start, either by giving you limited resources and asking you to fight something crazy like a flame tank on foot, or by making it so that you can't move in certain directions or across certain bridges without gaining the attention of a nearby endless zombie-like horde of soldiers. Or, and perhaps this is the most egregious AI issue in the entire game, tasking you with protecting a bunch of AI-controlled civilians living near a Tiberium field, which, by the way, will kill you if you stand in that field too long. You have no way to control those AI civilians directly, and if they decide they're going to go tiptoeing through the Tiberium-infused tulip field, there's little you can do to stop them. That was probably my least favorite mission in the entire game, and was so frustrating to get through, especially considering that the AI stupidity controlling those civilians was the cause of countless failures. I could have been playing a perfect mission, only to fail due to the idiocy of some civilian who just needed to walk across an irradiated field. Seriously, super frustrating. Now, for all you veteran Command & Conquer players jumping up and down and screaming, "Noob, you just don't know how to play the game," I will just say one word: sandbags. Yes, I know about the sandbags. And for those of you who may not know why sandbags are such a magical Command & Conquer tool, let me explain. While you're building your base in various units, you have multiple options to select from, as you might expect. You can build traditional things like vehicle centers, which allow you to create different weaponized transports, or barracks, which let you create soldiers of various types, or even some defensive units like turrets or missile launchers, which can help protect your base from various attacks. You also have the ability to build various structural elements to ostensibly provide additional protection for your base, and one of those structural items is the legendary sandbag. You might not think that a sandbag could stop an entire AI army dead in their tracks, but here you would be wrong, as the AI is completely unable to destroy or progress past a well-constructed sandbag wall. All they'll do is approach it, see that they've obviously reached the 3-foot equivalent of the wall in Game of Thrones, and stand there, dumbfounded as to what to do. Sandbags serve an equally vital purpose beyond those army-halting properties, and that is that they allow you to expand your base's reach using minimal resources, which in turn allows you to build different buildings and resources closer to certain key areas like Tiberium fields, allowing you to harvest resources more quickly and effectively. The way it works is, every building you create has to share an adjacent space with another previously built building. Meaning that as you build out your base, it'll start to appear to look like a series of neatly, or not so neatly, arranged buildings, all next to one another. Sandbags, being a core base structure, also allows for structures to be built adjacent to them, and because you can use sandbag walls or zigzagging patterns of sandbags to stretch your base well beyond its natural scope, that means you can also build various structures far away from your core base, since the sandbag counts as an adjacent base structure to build next to. Enterprising players have been using sandbags in this way to wall in enemy bases and literally deprive them of the ability to go anywhere or collect any resources, which is a bit of a cheat from my perspective, but is surprisingly effective, and was even recognized by the developers behind the Command & Conquer remake as a valid strategy to deal with the unfair AI and the impossible situations prevalent throughout the campaign. The remaster developers even said that the campaign feels balanced around your ability to exploit that particular AI cognitive weakness, to which I can only say, wow. For my specific playthrough, I never went full cheese to wall in an AI base and starve everyone inside, but I did use sandbags to expand the reach of my own base to harvest Tiberium more quickly, and in one instance, create an obelisk of light right near a heavily traveled section of map to help with my own assault. Going back to our stupid AI villager story, sandbags could have been used to wall off the AI civilians and prevent them from walking into the nearby Tiberium fields, but I didn't know about the wonders of sandbags at that point in my playtime, so I never pursued that option. Anyway, sandbagging aside, as I became more proficient with the game and understood how to play, I eventually began to come up with what I consider fairly effective strategies for dealing with your overpowered AI opponents. I know some of these might seem very simple for longtime CNC players, but as more of a casual fan of the series, I felt like a genius when I came up with and executed some of these maneuvers. The first one, and this is key, always prioritize either destroying or capturing the opponent's construction yard, which is the building that allows them to build all the other structures in the game, which also means it's the building responsible for allowing them to rebuild every structure in the game. I spent a good chunk of my first 8 or 9 missions not realizing this fact, and I would routinely knock out some critical base structure like an army barracks or turret, only to see it magically reappear a minute later to start spewing newly summoned soldiers into the world, or shooting me from behind as though resurrected from the dead. If I had taken out the construction yard first, this couldn't have happened, as any structures stay destroyed if the enemy doesn't have a construction yard available to it. Unless, of course, they have multiple construction yards on a single map, which is mostly reserved for the final mission of each campaign. Though with construction yards, my preferred approach is to try to capture it with an engineer, which gives you access to the opposing faction's building units, while also giving you a resource, oftentimes embedded deep within an enemy base, that you can use to start building out the equivalent of a remote outpost. Because as soon as you capture a building, it becomes yours, and all the rules of building other structures adjacent to it apply. There were a few late-game nod missions where I captured a piece of an opponent's base and dropped an already queued obelisk of light right next to my newly stolen building, creating an auto-targeting turret of destruction and wreaking havoc on enemy resources. The other benefit of capturing rather than destroying an enemy's construction yard is the fact that you can immediately sell the construction yard for around 2,500 or so Tiberium, which is a nice increase to your available resources, while also a major strike against your enemy. Something else I came to appreciate as I played the game more was just how critical a ready flow of Tiberium is for your success. By default, as I started playing the game, I would typically create a single Tiberium refinery simply to begin the influx of resources. But I'd oftentimes not construct my base all that close to a Tiberium field, or I might create my base near the Tiberium field that I first stumbled upon, which in many cases was not the optimal approach to Tiberium harvesting. 3 items to note here. Always build your base near a Tiberium field. Always confirm that Tiberium field is expansive enough to support recurring and regular harvesting. And, assuming you're in a late-game mission, always build 2 refineries, or at a minimum, build 2 harvesters. You really want the Tiberium to be coming in as quickly as possible, and the increase in harvesting rate associated with having a couple of harvesters working in tandem is too good to pass up, though I will say that depending on your refinery positioning, you may need to help those harvesters actually deposit their Tiberium, as occasionally the harvester operators simply stop working, and you have to give them a slight nudge to remind them what their job is. Not a huge deal, but something to keep in mind if you suddenly stop seeing Tiberium being harvested. Another mindset shift that I had to go through as I played the game was the concept that many missions are longer affairs than what I ever anticipated. When I first started playing the game, I'd go into each mission with the concept of creating as many grenade and infantry units as possible, and simply sending that army out into the world to demolish whatever enemies they may come across. As I mentioned earlier, this was a very flawed approach to how to play the game, and once I realized that each mission required a good amount of upfront preparation, as well as actual strategic planning and execution, my experience became 100 times more fun. Rather than building a bunch of on-foot units and sending them out into the world, I began creating my base infrastructure first, developing a strong Tiberium flow and economy, building several defensive and more advanced structures like vehicle factories, and utilizing the quicker movement-based vehicles like Humvees for the GDI and recon bikes for the Brotherhood of Nod to actively explore and uncover different parts of the map, which, like many RTSs, begins by being covered by a dense fog of war that only becomes clear by exploring the map. Gathering situational awareness of enemy structures, troop placements, and other geographic features is a key aspect of planning out your own eventual assault, and once I began thinking like a strategist, I began to really see what the game expected of me, and I truly began to appreciate the experience of playing Command & Conquer. There were some other more advanced techniques that I eventually developed, like multi-pronged concurrent base assaults, attempting to pull and separate units and vehicles from each other using my own quicker movement-oriented vehicles, and using lone infantry units to act as a target practice for enemy units that have difficulty hitting on-foot soldiers, like turrets and some tanks, while also using heavy artillery to destroy those enemies and structures at the same time. While all of those techniques did come in handy throughout the game, I will admit that getting to that level of understanding and strategy took me hours of failure. Once I figured it out though, holy cow, did the game become remarkably fun to play, and I started to relish the thought of multi-staged hour-long missions leading to hard-fought victories over incredibly challenging opponents. Even after beating both the GDI and Nod campaigns, which was a fairly lengthy process, I immediately was left wanting more, and I felt like I had truly become better at wargaming and strategic assaults as a result of my time with the game. Obviously, I'm not ready to lead any real-world skirmishes, but my game-related skill set improved dramatically over the 25 to 30-ish hours it took me to beat both campaigns, and I can now safely say that, if you take the time to really learn the game and develop your own strategies, you will almost certainly find a ton to like here. A couple other quick items to note before we move on. I recognize that part of the game's allure is the multiplayer aspect, which I'm sure is a ton of fun, assuming you're battling a similar skilled opponent. I didn't end up playing any multiplayer for this title, but I am absolutely curious how those human-based matches would play out. I'm sure I'm not as good as people who have spent the last almost 30 years playing the game, but I am curious how I would stack up against a random internet stranger. Secondly, I should once again mention that the remaster is undoubtedly the definitive version of the game, with improved graphics, controls, and the inclusion of pretty much every official mission released for Command & Conquer and Red Alert, whether on console or computer. I really want to spend some time playing the remaster, but for the purposes of this discussion, I only focused on the DOS original version of the game. And we're going to talk more about the specific aspects of that version of the game in just a minute. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially around the era of gaming that we typically cover, because back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet with YouTube gameplay videos and constant information at our fingertips. A lot of times when we made a buying decision in the game stores, it was based on either word of mouth, reviews we might have read in a magazine, and what the game looked like on the box. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, flip it over. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might have purchased it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Command & Conquer for the MS-DOS computer platform, the back of the box says, World Domination in a Box. Welcome to the New World Order. A gritty, high-tech world where the art of electronic intelligence and covert surveillance reigns supreme. Where guerrilla strategies and savage combat are the norm. Build bases, muster forces, and lacerate your enemies to the bone. All for the love of power. In the hyper-real combat experience of Command & Conquer, you're thrust into the heat of an all-out race for global control. Will you side with the humanistic GDI, or bring the world to its knees with the Brotherhood of Nod? Decide fast. Your adversaries are without mercy, and so are you. 2 CDs packed with over 60 minutes of intense action video and 3D rendered excitement. 2 sides to play. Fight the good fight with the GDI, or force the world to do your bidding with the Brotherhood. Over 35 missions in all. Your chance to truly dominate your friends with modem and network arena play. Digitized speech and adrenaline-pumping music featuring 25 original scores. From the creators of the best strategy game of 1992, Dune 2. And then there are a couple of quotes, not from game journalists, but by characters in the game. The one from Kane, the leader of the Brotherhood of Nod, says, "We have waited centuries for this moment. The rivers will flow with the blood of those who oppose us." And then another from the GDI. "We must stop Kane now before he and his cult trample down everything that's sane and right in the world as we know it." And then of course there are some screenshots on the back of the box showing different scenes from the game, and yep, this box sells me completely. This is an awesome back of the box. It really gives you a feeling for what the game's all about. The graphics look awesome. The whole gameplay experience sounds really intriguing. And there is a picture of a real-world actor on the back of the box, which means full motion video. You know that's going to capture my attention. Anyway, let's start talking about the more specific aspects of the game. We're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics for Command & Conquer are, for the most part, well done, with discrete designs for various infantry units, vehicles, base structures, and other environmental features for each level. That being said, you can definitely tell this is a mid-90s title, as the overall resolution of each of the human-centric units is pretty low. While each unit does have certain features to help distinguish one type from the next, I did notice a couple looked pretty darn similar, with a level of detail that wasn't quite sufficient for you to tell, at least at a glance, what units you had at your disposal. From an environmental design perspective, while I thought each map looked good, the individual missions for each campaign side can begin to look similar to one another, and for the most part, each map either has a green grassy background or a beige desert background, with no real variation in between those two biomes. It's not a huge deal, and different maps did have geographic features that made gameplay remain diverse from mission to mission, but visually, things looked pretty similar as you progressed from one campaign skirmish to the next. Something I did appreciate, though, was the quality of the full-motion video cutscenes that played in between missions, all of which looked pretty darn good for the era in which this game was created. None of those scenes were high definition by any stretch of the imagination, and the 3D rendered cutscenes that played out either before or after those FMV sequences definitely looked their age, but overall, I thought things looked fine from a cutscene perspective. The only other item to note, and this is more of a user interface thing as opposed to a graphical gameplay thing, is the fact that the after mission results screen is actually different depending on whether you're playing as the GDI or the Brotherhood of Nod, which I thought was a great touch. On the GDI side, everything was very straightforward and largely a metrics-driven affair, showing bars to depict how many casualties each side had taken, how many credits you had at the end of your mission, and a percent ranking of the overall efficiency and leadership qualities you demonstrated. While the Nod side had the same metrics, the way they're displayed to you is a bit different, with a more in-your-face style depicting the harsher nature of Nod-led missions. As an example, rather than simply looking at a bar chart to show how many casualties each faction sustained like you see with the GDI mission results screen, for the Brotherhood of Nod, there's a series of single infantry units depicting a certain number of dead soldiers, each of which animates as you succeed in getting more and more kills. I thought having different mission results screens was a nice touch, and helped to sell the belief that your gameplay experience and your focus is different depending on which faction you're playing as. It's a minor thing, but I appreciated its inclusion. The only other item to mention as it relates to the graphics is that the DOS version of the game features a pretty zoomed in view of the battlefield with no way to zoom out to survey more of your surroundings, which I found somewhat limiting in comparison to my personal preferences. I wish there was a way to zoom out of the action and take in more of the battlefield at once, but that simply was not in the cards for the original version of the title. Overall, the graphics in Command & Conquer looked fine, though I admit that if I had a crystal ball for a day, I would have definitely made some changes. Moving on to the sound and music, the music in Command & Conquer plays constantly as you're attempting to complete the various missions assigned to you, and for the most part, each track sounds pretty darn good. At least, at first. The thing you need to keep in mind is that these tracks are going to cycle through and repeat with each other on a continuous basis as you play the game, and there are some missions that could take you upwards of an hour to complete, especially if you're not entirely sure where an enemy base is or how best to assault a fortified structure. This means that you will almost certainly listen to the various tracks in the game numerous times, and after a while, the music starts to become a little bit old. It's not a huge deal, and the tracks themselves are all pretty well made. It's just the repetitiveness that can get a little annoying after a while. Sound effects, meanwhile, are all top-notch, with satisfyingly over-the-top grunts and death groans as you and your enemy kill each other repeatedly. These effects never get old, though I'd be lying if I didn't mention that hearing the game's narrator of sorts say, "Unit lost," constantly, even when you don't know where the heck an attack is coming from, can sometimes introduce a slight frustration to the experience. Otherwise, though, the sound and music here is pretty darn good, with my only real complaints being driven by my own repeated failings, which in turn made me experience a lot more repetition in music and sound effects than what others may experience. Moving on to the narrative and story. Command & Conquer takes place in an alternate timeline and reality from our own, where in 1995, a meteor crashed to the Earth, bringing with it a unique material that would later be named Tiberium, which was named that way due to the fact that the meteor had crashed into the Tiber region of Italy. This new precious resource, while highly toxic to humans and other living creatures, became prized for its unique properties that allowed for highly advanced scientific and technological creations, and as you might imagine, organizations across the world sought out ever-increasing quantities of Tiberium. The desire to harvest this resource provides the general backdrop of the two campaigns in the game, where you can choose to play as either the Global Defense Initiative, which is an anti-terrorist organization dedicated to keeping peace across the globe, and the Brotherhood of Nod, a cult terrorist organization led by an enigmatic man named Cain. These two factions come into conflict with one another, and depending on which side you choose, you're either attempting to thwart terrorist offensive maneuvers or attempting to conduct those terrorist actions, with the goal of manipulating media coverage to make it seem like the GDI is the bad guys, thereby setting up your own cell for future world domination. Whichever campaign you choose, your orders are clear. Defeat your enemies at all costs, or else. I've got to say, the general story framework here really worked for me, and I loved playing as both the GDI and the Brotherhood of Nod while attempting to complete the various objectives presented to me. I thought the fact that there were effectively 2 games included in this singular package was awesome, and the narrative and related FMV cutscenes did a great job of making me want to succeed in my mission for my chosen faction. I have no complaints here, as every aspect of the story was just enough to provide motivation for your missions, while at the same time not being burdensome. Definitely well done from my perspective. Moving on to the playability and controls, we've talked a good bit about the general structure of the game, its units, and how to actually play the game already, so I'm not going to rehash all of that here. What I do want to touch upon, though, are some of the more advanced controls in the title, as well as some observations as to how well those controls contribute, or don't contribute, to the act of playing Command & Conquer. The first thing to note here is that unit management can occasionally be a challenge. While the game lets you group units together, and you can still operate on individual units directly, there is a serious disconnect between your ability to micromanage your groups of units and the computer's ability to do the same. I know I mentioned this earlier when talking about the game's artificial intelligence, but it bears repeating. Micromanaging your units in a real-time strategy game is definitely a requirement, and here, the act of micromanaging can be a bit challenging. Luckily, the game does provide you with a speed slider that allows you to adjust the speed of the overall game, which I've read can allow you more time to make your own moves without the AI completely outclassing you. I never really played around with this slider though, and I simply kept the setting at the center, default position, though I am curious if anyone has any opinions on this one. The game also provides you with a number of different advanced controls to group and manage your units, like the ability to create teams of units, make certain units follow others, have units stop in their tracks, and even scatter units to make them more difficult to focus fire on. For the most part, these controls work pretty well, though I have noticed some significant issues with the stop and scatter commands, where occasionally the AI decides to act independently of your own commands, which is almost universally the wrong move in whatever situation you find yourself in. The most egregious issue with the friendly artificial intelligence occurs when one of your units sees an enemy harvester, which for some reason, your friendly units really don't like. That by itself kind of makes sense, because an enemy harvester is acquiring Tiberium for your opponent, so it stands to reason you'd want to try to defeat those harvesters whenever possible. That being said, the issue here is that attacking your opponent's harvester automatically draws the attention of nearly every enemy unit, who decide that they have to protect their precious Tiberium gathering machine, so they send forth the entire might of their military against you. If this is something you're actively trying to cause to happen, then that's totally fine. But more times than not, full-scale and unplanned wars get set off because one of your minigunners thinks to himself, I gotta shoot that, and then does in fact shoot the harvester, even if you haven't given any sort of guard or attack command. This can be extremely frustrating when it happens, and I wish the game had a way to more actively and accurately manage your squad. On the other side of the same coin, sometimes you issue a command to a group and a couple members of your squad simply stand there, presumably because they couldn't quite grasp what you were asking them to do, which might be as simple as, go walk over there. I'm sure there's some technological reason why your units will occasionally completely disregard your orders, but that does not change the fact that it can be irritating when your crew simply says no when you ask them to do something. At the end of the day, a lot of this game's critiques come down to the quality, or lack thereof, of the artificial intelligence at play in the campaign. If you're talking about the computer-controlled AI, it's oftentimes far more advanced and capable of managing resources than you are, and while I don't have concrete proof, I truly believe it cheats on occasion. If you're talking about your own friendly AI, it's oftentimes far less intelligent than you are, with next to no capabilities for managing resources or behaving the way any semi-sane human would behave in a similar situation. It's a frustrating mix, but as I mentioned earlier, you can eventually learn how to adjust to the game's various AI design mechanics. It just takes some time to get there. Once you do though, get ready for a ride, because there is a ton of goodness here, and even the original DOS version controls and plays great. At least once you're skilled enough to exploit the computer's weaknesses to ultimately support your own successful efforts. So, I've got to say, I did have a bit of a roller coaster with Command & Conquer, as my first experiences with the game felt almost unfairly difficult, with an AI that felt like it was cheating and overtuned in nearly every situation. It took me literally hours to become semi-proficient enough to simply stand a chance against the harder missions in the game, and even then, victory was more luck-driven than what I would have preferred. Eventually, though, the clouds parted, and I finally figured out how to really play the game, and what kinds of strategies lent themselves to successful operations. And once that happened, my entire experience changed for the better. Now, I should note that even with this newfound knowledge, I still couldn't steamroll the computer, and the final mission in the GDI campaign in particular took me hours to complete, simply because I couldn't muster enough forces to concurrently destroy 2 heavily defended enemy construction yards at the same time, which meant that one would rebuild the other indefinitely. I did finally conquer that challenge with a mix of an ion blast, many tank units, and a targeted Orca helicopter squadron swooping in to reduce whatever remained to rubble, but getting there was quite the journey. When the mission results screen finally played for that one, the game told me I had taken almost 4 hours to complete that mission, and while that might sound excessive for a single mission in a single campaign, I've gotta say, that was a pretty darn epic mission, and I truly felt like I had been in a war and emerged victorious. There were a number of these kinds of situations that I experienced after I began understanding how to really play the game, and in all instances, the feeling of accomplishment was absolutely awesome, and a complete 180-degree turn from my early game experience. If you have the time and the drive to devote some effort here, I would wager a bet that many people will see the very clear goodness here, and overall, I very much enjoyed my time with the game. So what is our verdict on Command & Conquer? Well, Command & Conquer's final verdict was not a foregone conclusion in any direction, because like I said, I had a true love-hate relationship going on for a good chunk of my time playing the title, and I honestly didn't know how I was going to rate this thing. But all of that uncertainty evaporated once I hit around the 10-hour mark, after which the game simply became a joyous, though still challenging affair that I simply could not get enough of. I ended up playing Command & Conquer into the very early hours of the morning, despite familial responsibilities and workplace commitments the following day, and I voluntarily gave up my own sleep to play just one more mission, or to attempt to achieve just a slightly better position on my currently played map. It took some time to get to that level of addiction and enjoyment, but once I did, the game wouldn't let me go, and it showed me very clearly how good it really is. Which is why for me, despite some questionable artificial intelligence, Command & Conquer is undoubtedly deserving of a spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. It's not an entirely smooth experience, and it is something that will take dedicated focus to fully and truly enjoy. But put yourself in the right frame of mind and devote enough time to learning the game's eccentricities, and you will find something that is supremely satisfying and fun to play. There may be a bit of a barrier to entry here, but from my perspective, overcoming that barrier is totally worth it, and as such, Command & Conquer has just become the newest member of our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Command & Conquer. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon-exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Biomotor Unitron, which is a Patreon-sponsored episode, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services. And if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about trying to bolster star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you to make sure that I am hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community, and I want to continue to make this the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Biomotor Unitron. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.